Good morning or good afternoon if you're joining us from Europe, and thank you for joining. As many of you may know, the European Union just went through one of the world's largest democratic exercises. Over 370 million voters across the bloc went to the polls between June 6 and 9 for European Parliament elections. I'm Eurasia Program. I'll be moderating the event today. I'm a fellow in the Europe, Russia, and Eurasia Program and director of the Leadership Academy at CSIS. So this exercise, as many of you know, is pivotal for the European Parliament elections. We've already seen some serious consequences for countries like France, but also a realignment of some political forces in the bloc. So we'll have a lot to talk about, from unpacking the results themselves, the consequences, the medium to long-term impact of this election, and of course, the politicking around the jobs that will come out of the election. I'm joined today by excellent speakers to help us unpack these results and leading experts on different aspects of the European Union, from politics to institutional structure. First is Dan Kellerman, who's McCourt Chair at the McCourt School of Public Policy at Georgetown University and non-resident senior associate with the CSIS Europe, Russia, and Eurasia Program. Dan's expertise focuses on the politics of the European Union, law and politics, comparative political economy, and comparative public policy. Next, we have Ilke Toyer, who's director of the Global Policy Center and professor of geopolitics of Europe at the School of Politics, Economics, and Global Affairs at IU University, and of course, non-resident senior associate with the CSIS Europe, Russia, Eurasia Program. Ilke's expertise focuses on European integration, EU institutions, elections, democracy in Western Europe, geopolitics and transatlantic relations, among many others. And last but not least is Sofia Rysak, who's researcher at the Center for European Policy Studies in Brussels. Sofia's expertise focuses on the fields of EU institutional architecture and, decision-making processes, which is particularly relevant as we talk about the EU results today. And she has a particular focus on the European Commission and EU democracy and accountability. Thank you all very much for joining today. So before I jump into the many questions I have for all of you, I want to give a brief overview of what happened for the results of the elections. As we were going into the election, there was a lot of talk of this far-right wave that was going to roll over Europe across all of the different countries. But it turns out that we have a slightly more mixed picture than expected. These far-right results really depend on where we are. And here, we're about to see the provisional results for the 720 seats of the European Parliament. So we're looking at the main groups here. The easy takeaway from this graph is the center-right, the European People's Party, remains the big winner of this election on the backs of a few big parties in some big countries. So in the political center, when we look at the EPP, Renew, S&D, the Greens, the election was a pretty good day, I will say, but it depends where you look. So we're seeing a bit of a loss of influence in some of these big groups in what you would call the engine of the European Union. In France, Emmanuel Macron's party lost quite a few seats. In Germany, Chancellor Scholz's party, the Socialists, didn't do as well as they probably expected. But the CDU, which was Angela Merkel's party, did quite well. And then we saw some gains in what you would call probably medium-sized countries, in Spain, in Italy, in Poland, for some of those center parties. So the balance of power might shift a little bit here. And of course, the one that everybody was talking about going into the elections is the ECR, which is the European Conservatives and Reformists. This is the party of Giorgia Meloni of Italy. There's a little bit of growth, but not major, and we'll talk about that as well. And the last thing I'll mention is some of the unknowns that we're looking at. And those are the non-attached members, that's the 45, and others, those are newly elected members, 44. Out of those, a few seats did go to far-right parties, for example, the AfD in Germany, but some went to liberal parties, left-wing parties. So we don't really know, as these new members come into the parliament over the summer, which groups they will align in, which might still shift the balance of power a little bit. So this is the picture we're facing about a week out from the elections. Sophia, I want to start with you here. I'd like us to discuss a little bit the importance of these elections for the EU as a whole, because there's been a lot of talk about the European Parliament and how important it is or not. And I'd also like to hear from you the significance of this particular round for the institutions, as we're kind of in a pivotal time for the European Union.
Yeah, sure. Thanks a lot. I mean, generally speaking, what is at stake at the European Parliament election? I mean, it really is about the elections of the members of Parliament, as in, not directly about who's going to head the EU executive. I don't know how far we're going to delve into the lead candidate procedure, but what is important, I think, just to know is that it is really mainly about who sits in Parliament rather than who will head the executive. However, institutionally speaking, the European Parliament is very important for the European Union. It has increased its power over the last, 3 decades, or actually throughout the whole time of European integration, but especially then. And it is involved, in most of the new laws, regarding single market, social policy, environment, and so on. So, the European Parliament is very decisive for policy making. The European Parliament, however, is the strongest when we have solid majorities, and you have given a good overview on the election results. And I think one main takeaway that we draw from this is that the 3 center parties that were responsible for most decisions in the last term, these are the Christian Democrats, the Liberals, and the Social Democrats, they have about 400 seats, so they have a majority. However, that majority is slimmer than in the last term. And as a result, what I expect, as an implication of this election could be that the European Parliament is a bit more busy with itself, more inward-looking, and therefore potentially a less reliable and predictable partner for the other 2 key institutions, the Council and the Commission.
That's an interesting way to put it, that the Parliament will be a little busier with itself, because I think you're right. We haven't really seen that very much. They've been very focused on putting out a lot of legislation, obviously in conjunction with the executive, but this might change now. Dan, I want to turn to you to talk a little bit more about the immediate aftermath. What are some of the biggest, most visible consequences we've seen, even in just the last week coming out of these elections, be it at the European level or national level? What are you looking at?
Well, at the national level, of course, there was the immediate decision by President Macron to call the snap elections. I'm sure we'll get into that a bit. So that really illustrated that even though these are European level elections, they can have resonances domestically. I think at the EU level, we're seeing some of the consequences even today in Brussels. We have EU leaders meeting to start this discussion about the top jobs. And I think one of the consequences of the election outcome is that, if anything, it helped von der Leyen's chances of returning for another term as Commission President, just because though the far right did make gains, as you were showing us with those numbers, in a sense, the big take-home was her party, the center-right EPP, did very well, and by far the largest party, et cetera. So that strengthened her chances. So I think those are some of the immediate consequences, this doling out of top jobs in the EU institutions. Yeah.
And speaking of top jobs, Ilke, let's talk about that a little bit. First, can you give us, and for any viewer who's not that familiar with it, what are we talking about when we say top jobs, and why does the election impact those? And then let's talk a little bit about who is currently being floated, because we've seen on the margins of the G7, for example, some names were not quite decided, but let's say pre-decided and solidified at a meeting in Brussels in about an hour that will start, and then confirmed at the end of June. So let's talk a little bit about what the top jobs mean.
Thank you. Actually, top jobs mean the leadership of the European Union moving forward. The European Parliament elections are not necessarily just defining the members of the European Parliament, but with the election and with the distribution of political groups, we enter into the juicy period, actually what we call the juicy period in the European Union, of negotiating who will lead the European Parliament, European Council, European Commission, and the fourth top job is basically the High Representative for Foreign and Security Policy in the External Action Service. Normally, these jobs are negotiated between the political groups. So the Christian Democrats, Social Democrats, Greens, and Liberals generally put out their representatives of the party groups. But of course, the national leaders also openly, implicitly, explicitly play a key role in negotiating. And what I should underline here is that in general, there is an intention to divide these top jobs between geographies inside the European Union. At the end of the day, it's a union of 27 countries. And there is also an intention to have a gender balance at the end of the day. Actually, at this time, the leadership is even gender balanced if it is approved as gossip right now, is positive gender balanced in favor of the women. Because we have the names of Ursula von der Leyen as the president of the European Commission for a second term. I also agree with Dan. I think her chances has generally improved with a better result for the EPP, with Macron being so busy with the national affairs and also not necessarily needing that much of the extreme right-wing vote at this moment in time. Secondly, we have Metsola for the continuation for the European Parliament's leadership itself. Then we have Antonio Costa, who was the former Prime Minister of Portugal, as a name as basically a socialist candidate for the leadership of the European Council. And last but not least, I think the European Union leadership wants to give the High Representative for Foreign and Security Policy job to an Easterner. And Kaja Kallas is from Estonia, is the most spoken candidate for now.
And on the last one, on Kallas, we've heard over the weekend even that a lot of European leaders got the assurances they wanted from her to make sure that in that kind of role, she wouldn't just focus all the time on Ukraine and on Russia. Obviously, there's a lot of focus to be had on those parts, but there is a lot of concern in other parts of Europe about the southern neighborhood and other parts of the surroundings of the European Union that an HRVP will have to focus on. I think that would also be a strong message to send, to have someone from Estonia in that role that would have probably a different view on the institution. She's also an energetic leader. She's been very visible on the international stage, so that would change quite a bit. For Antonio Costa, I'd like to stay with you, Ilka, and talk a little bit about potential issues around his candidacy, because we've seen news over the last few months coming out of Portugal around potential, let's say, judicial problems that he might be tied to. Does it look like the leadership of the Social Democrats has received the assurances they need to put his name forward, making sure that he wouldn't be tied to any of that scandal in Portugal?
Yeah, actually, this was a question that many of us has made throughout all these months, because his name was there from the very beginning. Then he was in this conversation about the link to the corruption scandal in Portugal. He resigned. He went through the process. And when we talk to the leadership at the Social Democratic group, we actually hear that they are happy with the result. They think that he's out of the woods, and actually he basically sacrificed his previous job for going through the judicial process. So what we hear basically around his name is not necessarily anything related to scandals, but many people believe that he's a calm, well-respected figure. He can play an intermediary role between the leaders. He's mostly at the end of his career, so he's not going to be that passionate about what is next for him. This was an issue we have seen in this legislation, actually. And lastly, the leadership of the political group also expects a better relationship between the European Council and the European Commission, because this was another issue that we have had in European politics, that the current leaders didn't necessarily get along. And this has really created a leadership problem for the European Union. So in all these aspects, my personal take is that the from day one, like on Monday, literally, S&D Group already started to name him and name him only.
That's an important point, because this was a European Parliament elections, but the people, the personalities in these top jobs do need to work together for things to happen, because all of these different pieces of the executive need to move forward with one voice. I mean, we've seen some really awkward events in the past, meetings with other heads of states, and you had von der Leyen and Charles Michel not sitting quite, it was just not always the smoothest of relationships. So I think, Ilke, is really important for you to mention that. So before we get into the real politics of everything that happened, I want to get back to you, Sophia, and talk about parts of the institutional impact separate from the executive, this time really for the European Parliament, of the elections. We saw the split in the groups at the beginning with the different split of seats. What are the results likely to mean for the parliament itself? You mentioned at the top it's likely to be busier with itself. So what are we going to see in the next few months? What kind of negotiations need to happen inside the parliament to give the committee chairmanships, and what does that mean exactly? Is that something that we should be following even?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, what is really important, as you allude to the internal procedure, is that, or processes that we see now, is that we don't know yet exactly the seat numbers. Why? Because what we do know is the result of the votes, but we don't know the final composition of the groups. And that is something very specific about the European Parliament, right? Because the political groups are composed of, let's say, socialist or green parties from across the EU. And with some group, affiliations, things are rather straightforward, but with others not. And we see after every election that this group affiliation is shifting. So the numbers that we do see now, they won't change dramatically anymore. But as you said in the beginning, there are still about 90 MEPs, which half of them will remain outside any group, but there are about 30 or 40 at least that will, want to join one of the other groups. And we see a bit of a horse trading going on right now, that the political groups, those parties that already know that they want to work together, they meet right now and they try to get on board more MEPs from other parties, because of course, the bigger a group is, the more powerful it is also. So these are like the intra-institutional processes that are unfolding right now. If we then look at, I mentioned intra-institutional throughout the term, it might be that the European Parliament is, less predictable because more inward-looking. That is the kind of inter-institutional dimension. But if we then look, intra-institutional, what does it mean also for the, let's say, decision-making dynamics within the European Parliament? Then we see indeed that the European Parliament the European People's Party, so the Conservatives, they are not only the party with the most seats, and actually also, came out even a bit stronger than we expected, but they will also really be a quite powerful agenda setter in the next term. And the reason for this is, that not necessarily that there's more MEPs to the right of them, but that there's less to the left. That there is hardly a majority finding process possible without the Christian Democrats. And that, of course, brings them in a quite, powerful position. And that might, of course, also turn the agenda of the European Parliament overall and the Commission thereby a little bit more conservative. But we will speak about policy probably later. What is important to know is that what we will see over summer is a process, or let's say we don't know yet exactly when it is, but it will be after the European Council has appointed the person. Let's just assume for a moment it will be von der Leyen. If she is appointed by the European Council, then afterwards she will go out and meet all the political groups, all the relevant political groups, for some kind of, again, a horse trading exercise in which she has to make policy promises in return for those groups to tell her, we're going to vote for you. So the time frame between the appointment of the European Council and the election of the European Parliament, of the Commission President, that is the moment of the maximum leverage of the European Parliament. And also, by the way, it's only direct and strong influence on the Commission's agenda because the Parliament is a legislative body which does not have a right of initiative. So only before the new Commission comes into office, or let's say this is the moment where it really has a strong impact on the Commission's and thereby the EU's agenda.
And I think that's really important for anyone watching to understand is that strange quirk of the European Parliament. It is a co-legislator, but the initial idea for a piece of legislation does not come from the Parliament. It comes from the Commission and oftentimes also from leaders in the European Council, informally, obviously, not in the actual institutional structure of the European Union. But I think you make really important points here on the agenda setting. Even coming out before the election, I think we were looking at potentially a far right that was more powerful, the ECR in particular. And in that scenario, Ursula von der Leyen would have had to really balance those promises she's about to make to different groups. And now she probably has a little bit more room to go forward with the agenda that both the EPP and the S&D would be likely to support. But let's now dig into the politics of these elections. And Dan, I want to talk to you about that a little bit. I'm curious, when you looked at the map, the results coming out of many different countries, and I want to keep France for just a few minutes from now because there's so much there. But because you work so much on democratic backsliding, what jumped out at you when it comes to, the democratic deficit of the EU, but also some countries where we've seen problems of democratic backsliding? How did those forces fare compared to probably parties who would be more likely to support stronger democratic values?
Sure, yeah. I mean, a few of the interesting results in that regard were that in Hungary, actually, Viktor Orban and his party Fidesz had their worst result in 2 decades. And although ironically, that wasn't really good news for the traditional democratic opposition in Hungary, what happened instead was that a new party, which was formed by a breakaway figure from Orban's party, who then basically broke with Orban, went against him publicly, and formed his own party, they emerged as the major opposition force in this election. If you look at Poland, actually the Democratic Governing Party, who's just last year took over from the Law and Justice Party, which had been kind of engaging in democratic backsliding, that new party led by Tusk, they did pretty well, so that's a good sign. In some countries where there have been worries about rising far-right forces, like in Portugal and Spain, they actually did less well than they had recently. So I think, in terms of anti-democratic, autocratic, far-right forces, et cetera, the worst results were in France, which we'll get to, in Germany, in Italy, but in a lot of other places, it actually wasn't such a bad picture. And anyway, that I can say more about the politics, but I'll stop there for now.
No, that's a great way to start. And I think just singling out Italy for a moment, these are far-right forces we've seen rise over the last few years, but this is one of the only countries too where they're in power almost by themselves. And Giorgia Meloni has masterfully managed to soften their image. In other countries, that's not the case, though. And I think now is probably a good time to jump into the France conversation, because I think we've all been following the news breathlessly for the last week. The party of Marine Le Pen, which is National Rally, did incredibly well. It got 30%, about 30% of the vote. The second biggest party in the election, Macron's party, had about 15%. So this kind of gap is really striking and really concerning, I think, for a lot of people in France, but really also for anyone looking at the European Union the way it is now, how important France is to policymaking impetus at, as I said at the beginning, a really pivotal moment in Europe. So what was your sense of the results? Is this a temporary fluke because the European elections are just less popular, fewer people go out to vote for them, or is this more of a structural shift for the far right in France?
Well, I think, the far right in France has been making steady gains lately. Also, the voting system for European Parliament elections is different than national elections, so that also affects the results. So we wouldn't necessarily see the same thing nationally, which I think is something that Macron is betting on in the move he's made to call new national elections. But look, I think the fact that there'll be a stronger presence from Le Pen's party in the European Parliament, that's not going to fundamentally change European politics for reasons Sophia and Ilka were going into. But the real thing people are worried about is if someone like Le Pen actually ascends to the presidency eventually. But so there's a scary sign in that regard, but we're far off from that. Now we'll see what happens with this very bold move Macron has made, and we can dig into that. I think opinion is very divided about whether he did something very clever, which will sort of divide the right in France and sort of quell this rising tide, or whether he made a foolish move which he'll regret. We'll see soon enough.
And we should specify in this case that it's not a new presidential election in France. These are legislative elections because the president has the power to dissolve the National Assembly, and that's what he's doing. He's just, in a way, he's gambling on the fact that the French electorate will be shocked by the election results for the European Parliament and will think, okay, the National Assembly is really important. We need to go out and vote because voting is not mandatory in France. So turnout is a big question mark here. And the electorate might look a little bit different because, as you said, the European Parliament elections is a slightly different terrain for the election itself. So that's something to look for sure. The first round of these legislative elections will happen on June 30th. It's a 2-round system, so there's already a lot of alignments we're seeing on the left side of the political spectrum. They will run one candidate per district or jurisdiction. On the right, though, things have taken a slightly different turn. And Ilke, I'd like to turn to you for that. What's been your sense of what's happening on the French right wing of the political spectrum?
Actually, what we are seeing in France is super interesting. I actually wanted to also reflect on the point that if this was a good move or this was a pure bargain gamble, but for me the question is that a bit, what was the alternative? Because we were already hearing very much that the French National Assembly will not be able to move forward with the budget. So the speculations about Macron will dissolve it throughout the year they were already there anyway. What was very surprising for all of us was that he has done this at 9 p.m. on the electoral night, basically right after that we learned about the provisional results in the European Parliament. So we actually left talking the results of the European Parliament elections, started talking about what is going to happen in France. And basically the last week was a key reshuffling in the party system in France, with declarations over declarations and really interesting dynamics that we have been watching. What I wanted to reflect one minute on that is that what I see is kind of a two-folded possibility here. A victory for Marine Le Pen's party, also in the national level elections, and entering into this period of cohabitation, what the French call cohabitation, so that the president and the leadership at the parliamentary level are different. And secondly, what I see is a hung parliament. I really don't see personally, this is my personal take, a third scenario of consolidation around Macron's party or around some kind of centrist vote, but you never know. These definitely are elections that we are watching with lots of curiosity.
Yes, Emmanuel Macron certainly has a flair for making grand announcements that really steal the spotlight away from pretty much anything else. And I think the media reaction to this too, or at least the headlines that we saw coming out of it, were pretty grandiose as well. I think especially a little less so in the French press, but in the English-speaking press, at least on the US side and in other outlets that tend to focus on the politics, I saw things like, is it Macron's Brexit moment? I tend to think, and I'm curious for all of your thoughts on this, I tend to think this is a little bit premature, but also a little bit overblown. But we also heard, and Sophia, you're in Brussels, so I'll be curious to turn to you in a second. We also heard that this created a lot of concern in Brussels, in the institutions. They're looking at some really important decision moments in the next few months for the European Union. And Macron's decision is creating, let's say, some concern in parts of the European Union. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it would have repercussions on the European level, right? I mean, let's assume the worst case, that would be a government led by the National Rally and, a Prime Minister, Jordan Bardella. And it seems a little bit that, I think probably Macron is thinking that either he wants to demonstrate that, the far right is not taking over France, right? And you alluded to it already. The voting system is different and people vote differently. They vote more right wing on EU level. So maybe his strategy is successful. But I think he is very well aware that this can go wrong. And then he kind of wants to follow this strategy of disenchantment or something, right? Let them govern and let them make it wrong. But it's super dangerous, and not only for France, because indeed also for the EU. I mean, he will remain president, so he will remain in the European Council. But a national rally government means that, in the council, so where the ministers come together, I mean, those will then be by people that were picked by, Le Pen and Bardella. So that might, paralyze the EU quite a bit. So this is on the repercussions. Maybe I can add one more point why, to put things a little bit in perspective, because what we saw in overall EU terms is a rise of about 2%, right? We're looking at now MEPs that sit on the right of the Conservatives of about 24%. That is a lot, but it's not a surge as it's been sometimes reported. Why is it so? Why is it portrayed as a surge? That is because we look into individual member states, especially France and Germany, and that is not only because, I mean, in France very significantly, but also in Germany they did rather well, but also because those countries get the most seats. So it's much more decisive what happens in France than in Germany. Germany has 69 seats. That is 96 seats. That is the highest amount of seats that you can get. Malta on the other side only has 6. So of course it is necessarily much more decisive what happens in Germany and France in terms of seat distribution. And this is also one reason why we look at those countries so much at the moment.
And I think that's a really important point. And before we talk about the policy implications of the election, I think it's important for us to talk about Germany for a little bit. I'm always on the side of let's make sure we talk about all the other EU members as well. And we did that a little bit. But in this case, exactly as you mentioned, Germany almost has 100 seats in the European Parliament. And the political situation in Germany has been changing pretty significantly over the last few years and over the last couple years especially. So let's talk a little bit about what happened there. And Sophia, we'll stay with you for a second on that. What kind of results did we see there? And is there cause for concern? Are we likely to see changes in the coalition, in its policy? I don't think we'll see early elections, but what are the repercussions of this election in Germany?
So what we saw in Germany was, in a way, surprising and not. So what was not surprising was that the biggest party was the main opposition party, the Christian Democrats. They came out with 30%, so they have a solid majority. So we do not have a situation like in France, right? It's the main opposition party, the Conservatives, have 30%, and the AfD, the far-right party, 16%. However, there was a race for the second place for quite a long time. You had the Social Democrats, the Greens, and the far-right party polling around 15%, all of them for quite a while. And in the end, and that I think came a bit as a surprise, the AfD did a little bit better than the latest polls showed, despite lots of scandals that they've been involved in lately. And also surprising that the Greens dropped even lower than they were polling. So they basically halved their delegation size. So that is the situation. That was the election result in Germany. And again, you see it follows a bit the trends that we usually see for European elections, in the sense that the government parties have been sanctioned. So all three, we call it the traffic light coalition. It's a coalition of the Greens, the Social Democrats, and the Liberals at the moment that is governing in Germany. And they all have been done very poorly. The Social Democrats had the worst result ever in any election, 14%. So you see the Germans are very unhappy with their current government, and this is what they voted for. European Parliament elections tend to be a referendum on the current government rather than an election on the topics that are actually at stake at European level, and that we see in both countries, France and Germany, like very, very nicely. I do agree with you. I also do not see snap elections there. Of course, the opposition parties in Germany, they're also called for that to stir things up a little bit. But Scholz is not Macron. He's a very, very different character, in fact. And it's also a different situation because, as I alluded to, the biggest party is not the far right, but the conservatives. And we are not talking, we're not anywhere close to the same figures as in France when it comes to far right support. And then, of course, we have a different political system, right? In Germany, we have a parliamentary system. That means if Scholz would call for snap election, then his own job is also at stake. And he would definitely not become chancellor in the next election because his party is doing very bad at the moment. So, for Macron, it's a bit easier because he can resolve the parliament, but he remains president.
It's quite a convenient situation, I think. And my understanding is also it's quite difficult in Germany to call a snap election. It's not quite the way it is in France. I think for Germany, we'll also, when you look at the map, we'll continue to see more results coming out in state elections over the next few months and federal elections coming up in the next couple of years. But when you see how much the AfD has gained in power in the east of Germany, I think that's a consequence that Germans and political space in Germany is going to continue to have to deal with over the next year, 2 years. And that's a whole conversation around why voters vote the way they do. But I think we unfortunately don't have time for that. That's another conversation. So I want to move to the policy impacts of this election because I think some things will change, some things won't, but there's a lot of really big files in the docket coming up. Obviously, still conversations around Ukraine, but also the Green Deal, technology. Ilke, I want to go to you first on this. What's your sense of what's likely to change in terms of policy priorities? I mean, Sophia talked about the horse trading that's about to happen and the leverage the parliament is likely to pull to decide on what the commission should work on, and what is likely to stay the same in those priorities over the next 5 years.
Yeah, before starting with the policies, I actually wanted to make one point about the previous conversation, is that what has been worrying for me beyond the specific cases of France and Germany that Sophia masterfully explained is the rise of Euroscepticism in founding members of the European Union. Because we have the case of France and Germany, then Italy, and then the Netherlands. And even I could add Belgium, because Belgium ended up with losing its prime minister over these elections. And of course, all the other elections the country held in that moment. But we are seeing a concrete rise of Euroscepticism and extreme voting in founding member states. I think this is a point where we should think about also the future of the project itself, beyond the policy implications or political implications of this election for the years to come. That's just a side note that I wanted to make. When we go back to the policy conversation, of course, the questions that we have on the table are mostly about the most important policies moving forward for the next legislation: security and defense, the future of the Green Deal, clearly enlargement, and of course I cannot not mention migration, because it has been, according to early conversations, I don't want to sound so solid on this because we still need data. Migration has been a very important point for voting, also among the younger generations. What I wanted to bring in there, also, I think it explains very much the voting that has happened last Sunday, is that I think there's a common sense in the EU that the neoliberal system is not necessarily delivering right now so well, and there's a cost of living crisis. There's a housing crisis. There's some kind of a question about how well we are doing in the European Union, and if you add into the feeling of insecurity in the world, so these geopolitical issues, we end up with a crowd that is it's not just the European Parliament that is inward looking. We have an entire continent that is tending to look inwards. So I personally think there will be lots of conversation about migration. And migration is not just migration. I think it's also a very important conversation about demography in general. Then we will see enlargement also as a part of the conversation about the budget and how to spend, because at the end of the day, enlargement policy requires a great deal of investment from the European Union side. And last but not least, the Green Deal. Some would like to read this picture as a moment to water down the Green Deal. But the legislation is already there. The conversation is going to be about the implementation of the Green Deal. And maybe I can say one thing about this. What I see more and more is that our conversation about Green Deal will shift from fight against climate change to Green Deal and competitiveness. How this green transition actually favor European economies, create job opportunities, and contribute to the GDP of the countries. So my personal take is not necessarily just watering down as such, but mostly a shift of focus in the policy preferences.
And your point on the Green Deal, I think, is a really important one, because we saw the Greens did quite poorly, I think, based on what they were expecting, but also based on their 2019 results. But I don't think this should be interpreted as that means the importance of fighting climate change has gone down, especially for younger voters. That's not the case at all. I think it's because a lot of other parties have integrated this into their platform. As you said, Ilke, the legislation has been passed, so now the question is implementation. And the Greens have been having a harder time making the case that they are the only ones fighting for this. And so we're looking at this a little bit differently now, even though we did see in some parts of the center-right to right of the political spectrum some conversations around watering down parts of the implementation around combustion engine, but also nature restoration, even though that apparently passed just today. But I think that's a really important point to make. And Dan, I want to ask you the same question. In your mind, what is likely to change and what's likely to stay the same over the next legislature?
Well, yeah, let me just, before I answer that directly, just remind everyone when we talk about adopting policy and the parliament's role in that, we've got to count votes and think about it that way. So, first of all, there's 720 seats, as you said. You need 361 to become Commission president. And that's the majority that von der Leyen, who presumably is going to be put forward by the member states, nominated by the member states, she's going to need 361 in the parliament to become president. But something to keep in mind when we then start thinking about policies down the line, it's not always the same majority that votes, on every policy. There can be shifting majorities on different policy dossiers over time. So that's something to keep in mind. So, for instance, on some of the issues that Ilke raised, like on migration, one could imagine von der Leyen relying on votes from the far right, even some of those, to support a more, let's say, conservative kind of reforms of migration, whereas on other issues, she might be more in the center. And anyway, before I answer your question again on policy, the one thing I want to say, thinking about those numbers, is that the real issue or dilemma for the center, or for someone like von der Leyen, in thinking about how to construct a majority to back her, both to back her to become president and later to back her on policy, is that right now, as you showed in that initial graphic, that centrist coalition of the center-right, the Christian Democrats, essentially, the Liberals and the Socialists have 406 seats. That would sound like that's enough. That's a majority. But a lot of people predict not all of the members will actually support von der Leyen for president and wouldn't support her on different policy files, because these aren't tightly disciplined parties, right? And so then that means if you don't have a solid coalition of those three central parties, then you have to get some other votes. And the big dilemma on all these different policy issues is that, in essence, she can either go looking for votes to her left, which is basically the Greens, okay? And on some things she might want to do that, or she can go looking on the right, which, let's say, Meloni. But there's trade-offs, because if you go looking for votes from Meloni, then parties like some of the Socialists have said, or Greens, others said, well, then we won't support you anymore. We don't want anything to do with the toxic far right. Likewise, if you go for support on, let's say, some policies from the Greens, well, then maybe elements of the center-right which want to, let's say, bring back combustion engines and, back off on some of those commitments, you would lose them. So that's, as it often is, the kind of dilemma for the centrists and center-right is which way do you go? So anyway, but on your question of policies, I would agree with everything Ilka said. I think, those are some of the key policies: Green New Deal, migration, enlargement. I would just add one more, I think, that wasn't mentioned, is rule of law, which is a big issue for the EU in recent years, how to deal with rule of law and democratic backsliding, most famously in Hungary, but also for a time Poland was a big concern. That's seems to be resolved now. But there's new cases cropping up, Slovakia, and then Italy itself under Meloni, although, as you said, she's tried to sanitize her image, etc. A story just came out in Politico Europe today highlighting this dynamic where something that wouldn't seem very controversial, an annual rule of law report, so not something dramatic like sanctioning a country or suspending funds like they did from Hungary, just a report on the situation of rule of law that was set to come out this summer. Well, it turns out what's been reported is that von der Leyen pushed to delay this report till after a new commission president would be agreed on, et cetera, because the report was going to be very critical of Meloni's governments and their attack on media freedom. And she thought, well, that could look bad for her if she's trying to do deals with Meloni. So that just shows how there's a kind of intersection or interaction between the tussle over the top jobs and von der Leyen's effort to get backing in the European Parliament on the one hand, and some of these key policy issues like the fight to defend rule of law, media freedom, etc.
That's a really important point, because it might seem like a report is not that big a deal. The optics of it are pretty negative, and we've seen that with other reports in the past, like press freedom in Greece, for example, has gone down pretty significantly over the last few years. So for von der Leyen to use her levers of power to do something like this is fairly significant. To stay on the policy, just considering that we have a mixed audience here, obviously a lot of people in the US, but some people in Europe, I'm curious for all of your opinions on what this is likely to do for foreign policy in the transatlantic relationship. Obviously, we're in the middle of a lot of big conversations. We've got the NATO 75th anniversary coming up in the summer. There's a lot of questions around enlargement for Ukraine, for Moldova, but also the Western Balkans. What are we likely to see? Is there going to be is it likely to be a shift in approach? Do we see, based on obviously provisional results and the gossip around the top jobs, are we on the path to keep a steady approach towards Ukraine or any of those files? And maybe Ilka, we can start with you on that.
Yeah, I think this is a very really good question, but for answering that, actually, we need to wait for the second round of the European Parliament elections, which is basically the presidential elections in the US. Right now, foreign and security policy conversation is clearly ongoing in some of the files that we have mentioned. I think there is more and more convergence in the necessity of a European security and defense conversation, not only on the clearly the industry side, but also the having.
We're having some technical difficulties.
Should we continue our conversation while they're frozen?
Okay. We'll just pick up with Ilka when she's back. But then, Dan, let's have you jump in on the same question.
Yeah, well, actually, I think, directly to your question, I think what we've seen so far probably signals a continuity on issues of Ukraine and foreign policy, defense, just because the most likely scenario now looks like von der Leyen will remain in the leadership. As we said, one of the most likely candidates for the foreign policy, the High Representative, is Kallas. Both those moves would indicate a strong line on support for Ukraine and strengthening common European defense, et cetera, because both of those are figures who have very clear views and consistent, strong pro-Ukrainian views in that regard. So I think, that bodes well for solid EU policy in that regard.
I think Ilka's point too, before we lost our online guests, around what's happening on this side in November is a good one. In the meantime, though, we know that Ursula von der Leyen and President Joe Biden have a pretty good relationship. I would say a very good relationship, actually. They see eye to eye on a lot of things. And even besides this, someone like Kaja Kallas is likely to be very forward-leaning too, as HRVP, head of EAS, and try to really go around, meet a lot of people. She's already met a lot of important leaders around the world in her current position. So I think that bodes well for a proactive view of this. I'll be curious to see what her general approach to enlargement is, but obviously this doesn't lie necessarily with her. But she's also likely to be forward-leaning on EU defense. We've seen a lot of that, a lot of proposition from Estonia around policies, joint ammunition, etc. So I think that's likely to be a pretty positive view across the top jobs we're seeing now. Not a ton of change over this. We'll just keep going until we can get our guests and our friends back from Europe. Hopefully, that's not a sign for the transatlantic relationship in the next few months. But I'm curious to pull the thread then a little bit more on the rule of law comment that you made, because when we talk about this, obviously the Commission has a big role to play with those different reports that come out. The Council has a big role to play as well in terms of Article 7 procedures, triggering those or not. Where do you see the role of the European Parliament in not controlling the situation, but keeping an eye on any kind of democratic backsliding?
Yeah, it's a great question. The Parliament, along with the Court of Justice, which isn't a political organ, but it's part of the EU, has been the strongest backer of tough EU action on the rule of law crisis, if we call it that, and democratic backsliding in some member states. So if we go way back to 2012, it was really the Parliament that issued the first kind of reports that were calling out the beginnings of backsliding in Hungary. And again, it was the Parliament, for instance, that just a couple years ago issued again this declaration that said Hungary is no longer a democracy, but is become a kind of electoral autocracy. So the Parliament is pushed again and again for action, and the Commission, I think, in part responded to that. So the Commission became a little more proactive in the past 2 years on this issue, and part of that was because of pressure from the Parliament. And the Council, they don't listen so much to the Parliament, and they continue to be a reluctant actor. So I think the Parliament is important in that regard. And sadly, for those who care about this issue, actually, because the Greens and the Liberals were the big losers in this election, one of the repercussions of that is that actually a lot of the specific MEPs who had played leading roles, heading committees or producing reports on these issues, actually lost their seats. So that's unfortunate.
I'm glad you raised that, because that's where voting in the European Parliament really becomes important. I mean, obviously, it's important as an act of citizenship and democracy, but there are real implications of policy to the people who come into the Parliament. So I think it's important for people to remember that. And we should also note that the Parliament obviously plays a huge role in approving the budget.
Yes.
We're currently in the middle of a cycle, which is a 7-year cycle for the budget. But in the middle of their next term, they will have to vote on a new one. Mm-hmm. And that's also where we're going to see a lot of policy priorities be either prioritized or deprioritized, depending on how the money is allocated. Do you see any possible shifts in priorities reflected in the budget?
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing, just even before I get to that, or to put that in context, just to continue on our last point, the rule of law issues, it's not just a niche.
Recording in progress.
Oh, it's not just a niche issue for those worried about countries like Slovakia or Hungary, or maybe even new developments in Italy. One thing we've seen is that these issues then relate to the bigger picture of foreign policy, EU enlargement, common defense. Because if we recall, right, in the last year, we saw, for instance, Viktor Orban threatening to veto the opening of enlargement talks, threatening to veto funding for Ukraine, military funding. So standing up on these issues has repercussions across the board. Now, on the budget, Yeah, I think one thing we've seen definitely is that the budget is becoming more and more a powerful tool of across a range of issue areas in the EU, for instance, on these rule of law issues, using budget conditionality. Eventually was one of the most powerful weapons to basically threaten to suspend funds to states that violate the EU's core values. And I think in the next round of budget, one thing we're likely to see is that this idea of using the budget more strongly to push for reform will just become the norm. So we saw that not only for, let's say, rule of law issues, but we saw it more generally with the whole post-COVID recovery funds, where when this huge pool of money was put in, they said, okay, we're going to give money for post-COVID recovery, but countries have to submit these plans, these recovery plans, where they're basically committing to structural reforms, to green transition, et cetera. And I think from now on, something we're likely to see is that there's going to be a much more conscious effort to use the budget as a kind of not just giving away money, but as a tool with strings to push countries in the directions the EU wants to see them go.
Which feels like another step in the maturation of the European Union as a complex institutional structure. But I want to welcome back Sophia and Ilke. Ilke, you got cut off, so in the last few minutes we have left, I want to make sure you get to finish the point you were making on the foreign policy implications. And Sophia, I'll turn to you for the same question, and then we'll wrap up. Oh, just 1 second. Here we go.
So Sophia heard them all. But anyway, what I was saying basically is that we have some consensus in dossiers like supporting Ukraine for now, investing in European security per se, rethinking how to move forward in Green Deal, and when it comes to migration, actually, I would say rather preventing migration, at least irregular migration, to correct that. But most of these policy dossiers will actually depend on the second round. This is what I was saying in the US presidential elections, and the budget conversation that is up to come in the following year, because this is the point where we will really see what the priorities of the European Union are and what are the plans to finance them. Because being in favor of enlargement, it sounds great on paper, but then we will see if this policy dossier will function as long as they dedicate the necessary resources to that file. I would say the same for security policy, for example. Sounds great that we invest in our own security here in Europe, but then how we move forward will very much depend on the industrial policy in that side, the defense industry, not just on like when it comes to spending more, but also getting the steps done for spending more, better, and together. And all these discussions about theoretically what we want and practically what we will do in the new legislation will be better defined after the US presidential elections and together with the conversation about the budget.
Sophia, let's go to you with those final words.
Yeah, sure. So on, policy implications for the defense and Ukraine support and so on. I mean, I from what I take, observers don't expect the least changes in this area. Also, why? Because here in the whole foreign policy and defense area, the parliament is, of course, not the most decisive actor, right? It remains mainly in member states' hands. Also, of course, if you look at, those members of European Parliament that are really outspokenly pro-Russia, for instance, their share increases a little bit, but overall remains small. But, Ilke and Dan are much more experts on the foreign policy, so I'm going to leave, more assessment to them. But let me maybe add one point on the effects overall that, these, the far right can have, to put things a little bit in perspective, because I think we have to remind ourselves that in a parliament like the European Parliament, to make it, to really shape a decision, to adopt a decision, and also to block it, you need 50% plus one, right? And even if those parties have, are around 24%, which is a lot, again, this is not enough yet to shape decisions. So it's not that, the far right are not going to shape decisions in the European Parliament. It will depend a lot on the center parties and on the mainstream parties, in how far, in two aspects. First of all, in how far they will be adopting the rhetorics and agenda points of the far right, but also second, in how far they will cooperate with them. And Dan, you gave a very good overview over, the complex, coalition finding structures and so on. And you mentioned the pact, or this kind of agreement that the center-left parties have indeed made, where they said, look, we're not going to vote for you if you work together with the far right. But of course, so that might mean that if we look at the next agenda, then indeed, the Greens, for instance, are in a quite powerful position to kind of put their, agenda points in there, because if she wants to exclude the far right, she will be dependent on the forces to the left. But then again, that doesn't mean that throughout the term, those far-right parties are not voting together with the Christian Democrats, for instance, right? You don't have to make a formal agreement with the far-right, but nobody can stop them from voting together. You see what I mean? And here, I think, is again the difference that Dana also explains between the vote on the agenda and on the president that we will see in a few weeks, and then the ad hoc coalition finding throughout the terms on different policies.
Well, that brings us to the conclusion of our conversation. There's so much that we could have talked about on top of it, but there's also a lot that we don't quite know yet. I think Ilka made the mention of this a couple times. We need to see a few things coming in the next few months. So briefly, in what comes next, we'll have obviously the decision on the commission president, a lot of the horse trading happening over the next few weeks, then a final number on who is going to have what kind of force in the parliament for the different political groups, the president of the parliament, the HRVP, and then throughout the fall, the College of Commissioners as well. Obviously, we didn't talk about that, but the parliament approves all the commissioners that will have very important files to deal with over the next few years. And that will be part of the horse trading as well. Each member state has to put forward a couple of commissioners, at least candidates, if von der Leyen does it the same way she did it before, assuming it's her. We never know. There could be a twist in this story, but and then the parliament will be voting on that all the way through the fall. And obviously the European Council president has a term until December 1st. So this is not an immediate resolution. There's a lot that will still happen. A lot of conversations still, I'm sure, we'll have around France and what happens in Germany. But I'm glad we were able to unpack really what happened for this election. And just to recap, I think it's important to say this far right wave was a little bit more of a wavelet. The center right is the clear winner here coming out of this election, but the center did not cave. And I think that's a really important message to leave our viewers with. So I want to thank all of our speakers today, Sophia, Ilka, Dan, and for a conversation I found really interesting, and hope we can have more of those in the future. So thank you all for joining, and thank you to everybody who watched online for joining us as well. I hope everybody has a fantastic day.
Thank you.